In the last section, we installed the next routes module. Now that we've got this thing installed, we're going to do a little bit of setup around it. The official documentation says that we're supposed to make a routes.js file and then eventually set up a lot of the configuration for our different routes inside there. Then later on in the documentation, it also says that we have to do some setup on our server as well. So rather than just dive directly into this documentation, I want to show you a diagram that's going to give you a better sense of the different files that we're about to create. So the first thing we're going to do is make a routes.js file. This file is going to define the different custom routes inside of our application. And by custom routes, I'm talking about the different routes that have tokens inside their URLs. So these three down here. The original two routes that we have up here have no custom tokens or parameters or anything like that inside the route, so we don't need to define those inside the routes.js file. These two routes right here will be taken care of by the default routing system that is included with Next.js. Besides that routes.js file, we're also going to create a new file called server.js. You see, by default, just making this routes.js file inside of our project directory does absolutely nothing. We have to actually tell Next.js to use that routes file. So the purpose of this server.js file is to manually start up our Next application and specifically tell it to use all the routes that are defined inside of here. Now that's not the only purpose of routes.js. The other thing that routes does is it is going to eventually export a set of navigation helpers that will allow our components to automatically navigate our users around our application. And you'll recall that is exactly at the end of the day what we're trying to do right now. We want to automatically navigate our user from our campaign new component to somewhere else inside of our application. So eventually, after creating this file and doing all this setup, we're then going to use this file inside of some of our different components. And just so you know, even though our current component doesn't need this route stuff set up, that's why we're going through all this setup right now, because the helper that we're going to use to navigate around the page is going to be exported from this file. So that's why we're doing all this setup right now. Okay, so let's make the routes.js file and start to define our different routes. So back inside my code editor, I'm going to make a new file inside of my root project directory called routes.js. Inside of here, we're going to require in the next routes library. So I'll say const routes is required next-routes. Now a couple things to point out here. Notice how I have placed a second set of parentheses after the require statement. If I go back to the official documentation, you'll see that the official documentation over here has that second set of parentheses as well. That means that the require statement right here returns a function. And by placing the set of parentheses right after that, that function will be invoked immediately after we require it into this file. So just make sure you get the second set of parentheses after there. Now eventually, we're going to come back to this file and set up some of the different routes that we want to have inside of our application. But we don't need to create any of those special routes just yet. Remember, we only have to set these routes up for any of the routes that have a custom token inside them, like these three down here. So we're going to eventually set those up, but not just yet. So I don't have to place any other statements inside this file just yet, except for my export statement. So I'm going to say module.exports equals routes, like so. Okay, so that's all we have to do inside the routes.js file, believe it or not. This export statement right here at the bottom is what is going to export some helpers that's going to eventually allow us to automatically navigate users around our application. So this export statement right here is really why we're going through all this setup. Now the next thing we have to do is set up a server.js file. And remember, the purpose of that is to make sure that we can manually boot up our Next application and specifically tell it to use our routes.js file. The code that we have to place inside this server.js file is listed inside the documentation over here as well. So if you're all curious, you can always take a look over here at some of the different lines that we're going to have to write. So we're going to write this first block right here. That's going to create a next application. And then we're going to also write this second block, or third block, I guess, down here, because we are not using Express.js inside of our app. So we're going to write this stuff and this stuff. And this basically sets up Next.js and tells it to use all this routing stuff that we are putting together right now. So let's get to it. Back inside of my code editor, I'm going to make a new file inside of my root project directory called server.js. And then inside of here, we're going to write all the code that we just saw a moment ago. So I'm first going to say create server equals require HTTP. And notice we have curly braces around this one. Then we will also require in the next library. I think that, let's see what the snippet also does at the top. Okay, so next we're going to use that next helper right here to create a new app instance. So we will say after that, const app equals next, and we're going to pass a configuration object into this thing. It's going to have a single property of dev. This dev flag right here specifies whether we are running our server in a production or development mode. So for the value, we're going to put process.env.node_env, and we're going to say does not equal production, like so. This tells our application to look at a global environment variable called node environment and look to see if it is set to the string production. If it is, then it means that our application must be running in production mode, and it's going to change the way that Next behaves. Now, immediately after this, we're going to place some of the actual navigation logic that is required. So we're going to say const routes, and we're going to require in that routes file that we just made. So I'll say /routes. And then after that, we're going to start placing some of the other code that looks a little bit more arcane, but trust me, it all is tied to this navigation stuff. So we're going to say const handler equals, routes.getRequest handler, and we're going to pass in the app object. And then finally, we're going to set up the app and tell it to listen to a specific port. So I'll say app.prepare .then, and then we're going to pass a arrow function into this. Inside the arrow function, we'll say create server. We'll pass in the handler that was just created, and we'll tell this thing to listen on port 3000. And then we're going to pass in a callback function to this as well that will be called with an error if one occurs. Inside of here, we'll check to see if an error exists, and if it does, we'll throw the error. And then finally, we'll print out a success message of ready on localhost 3000, like so. Okay, so I know that a lot of the code inside this server.js file looks very mysterious right now. We are going to eventually come back to this file and do a lot more customization to it. So we're going to kind of just gloss over the code in here for right now, because we're going to have a much deeper discussion on this stuff later on when we eventually come back. Now the last thing we have to do is customize our startup script. Inside of our package.json file, whenever we run the command npm run dev, we are currently executing the command next dev. So this command right here assumes that we have absolutely no customization to next inside of our app. In other words, it's going to just start up next, it's going to read from our pages directory, and then try to start showing some content. But we don't want that. We want to customize how next behaves. So rather than having next just run off and do its own thing right here, we're going to instead tell next to run our server.js file right here. So that's going to customize what next does when it starts up, and it's going to allow us to customize our routing solution. So I'm going to change the dev script right here to be node server.js instead. All right, I know that's been a lot of code changes, but the last thing I want to do is test this out at the terminal. So I'm going to flip back over to my terminal, and I'm going to run the command npm run dev. And then when I do so, I should eventually see the message listening on localhost 3000 appear on the screen. There we go. All right, let's restart or refresh inside the browser, and just make sure this is still working. So back inside the browser, I'm going to wait for just a second. You'll notice that we're still doing a reload here. It always takes forever to restart the server because it has to rebuild a whole bunch of different files. I'm going to try doing a manual refresh here really quick. Okay, there we go. So it looks like everything is still working. Now to you and me, it looks like basically nothing changed, and I agree with you, this section probably seems a little bit esoteric, but we essentially just substituted in our own custom navigation solution that is going to allow us to have dynamic routes as we start to work on some later aspects of our app. So let's take a break right here. We're going to continue by making use of that new navigation system and make sure that after someone successfully creates a campaign, we then automatically redirect them to somewhere else inside of our app. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.